Hello and welcome to Edge of Emotion. After losing her job following a divorce from her wealthy husband, a doctor and her daughter moved to the wilderness for an inheritance. But upon seeing what was bequeathed to them, the bus driver dropped them off at an inconspicuous, unnamed stop, which immediately raised suspicions. Had they even arrived at the right place? "Mom, is this our stop? Where's the village? And why can't we see any houses?" Sandra asked in surprise. In response, Jessica looked at the driver, who helped her unload their suitcases from the bus. "Yes, this is your village, don't doubt it for a second. I've been on this route for years. You just need to walk down this dirt road, and the village will be right there," the man explained. Jessica Peterson thanked him for his help and breathed a sigh of relief, placing the suitcases on the sun-warmed asphalt. Traveling in reality was much more complicated than it seemed from the comfort of her office as a therapist. Normally, bulky luggage should have been stored in the baggage compartment, but since the driver picked them up on the road due to the lack of tickets, the suitcases served as seats for Jessica for some time. They had spent about 4 hours on the road, exhausted and demoralized by what had happened. A painfully bitter divorce, unfair dismissal from work, and the hurried preparation for relocation. All of this within tight deadlines, leaving Jessica's head spinning. Since Sandra had slept for most of the journey, Jessica stayed awake, guarding her sleep. Every time the bus hit a bump or fell into a pothole, it jolted, forcing Jessica to hold on to the suitcases, which served as her makeshift seat. Meanwhile, the bus doors slammed loudly, after which the driver started the engine and smoothly pulled away, bidding farewell to the travelers with a puff of exhaust fumes. "Well, buddy, shall we go slowly?" Jessica suggested, watching the departing bus. "Yes, Mom, let's go." "What if it gets dark, and I'm scared of wolves?" the little girl said, looking around apprehensively. Just a couple of months ago, Sandra had finished second grade, but reasoned like an adult. Jessica smiled and replied in her usual playful manner, "Don't worry, sunshine. There might be wolves around, but we still have a long way to go before we reach the forest. So don't think about that, everything will be fine, I promise." Joyful sparks appeared in the girl's eyes. "Really? Well, let's go then. Do you know if our house will be big or not very?" Jessica shrugged uncertainly. "Oh, if only I knew. I got this inheritance by pure chance." One good patient made an effort. Taking the suitcases in both hands, she walked along the dirt road indicated by the driver. Sandra obediently followed, kicking up a cloud of dust with her small feet. Since the village was situated on an elevation, they had to walk uphill the entire time. After a couple of 100 meters, Jessica finally gasped for breath and set the suitcases down on the ground. "I definitely don't have enough strength for this," she thought ruefully, barely able to stand under such a burden. "Mom, are you tired? Maybe I can carry them?" Sandra asked with concern in her voice. Jessica smiled at her daughter. "Where would you carry them? They weigh more than you." At that moment, Jessica suddenly heard a strange noise behind her. What was it? A motorcycle? No, it didn't sound like one. The noise was much louder and had a distinct rumble. A car? "Oh my goodness, it's cars," Jessica's mind raced. Her surprise was palpable when she turned around and saw the distinctive vehicle. "Taxi? Does someone still call a taxi to such a remote place?" she whispered. "Mom, maybe the car is coming for us?" Sandra asked hopefully. "No, who would send a taxi for us out here?" Jessica replied. Meanwhile, the car in a cloud of dust caught up with the weary travelers. After driving a few meters, the taxi driver stopped and, opening the passenger door, said, "I can give you a ride. If you need, hop in and I'll load the suitcases." Jessica exchanged a questioning glance with Sandra, then decided to accept the offer. Taking the front seat, she seated her daughter in the back and closed the door. The tall taxi driver quickly handled their suitcases, stowing them in the trunk. "Well, shall we go?" he said, starting the engine. "I'm Jessica, And this is my daughter, Sandra, the passenger replied shyly. The taxi driver nodded, and his conspicuous yellow car roared to life, heading towards the village. To pass the time on the journey, Jessica cautiously asked, "You're probably on a call, right?" The driver smiled. "Yeah, delivering medicines to the field hospital. They've set up a medical station in a house near the village, and they hired me as a courier to pick up drugs from the pharmacy warehouse. Much more convenient this way, especially since I've done this route several times." "Oh, a field hospital? That's serious. I wouldn't have thought a village like this would have its own medical staff," Jessica remarked respectfully. "Well, with no other medical facilities around for miles, and the district clinic being quite a trek away, having your own transportation is necessary. But a small problem has cropped up. The doctor there, Arthur Gardner, he's been working there for 80 years, but he fell ill, got sciatica. There's no one else to see patients," the taxi driver replied, keeping his eyes on the road. Jessica nodded sympathetically and looked out the window. Along both sides of the road stretched vast yellow fields and sparse patches of woodland, gradually giving way to dense forest. "So, where do you need to go exactly? What's the address?" the taxi driver asked again. Jessica startled. Then she reached into her purse and unfolded a paper folded several times, reading aloud, "All right, Central Street, number 7. Do you know where that is?" In surprise, the driver hit the brakes, and the car came to a sudden stop as if rooted to the spot. "William, what's wrong with you? Is something the matter?" she asked, concerned. The driver looked at her with surprise before saying, "Are you sure you're not mistaken? Central Street, number 7, right?" "Yes, that's right. Why would I be mistaken? It's clearly written in black and white," she replied. The taxi driver shook his head ruefully. "You've probably been given the wrong coordinates. You see, that address is where the field hospital is located, where I'm delivering medicine at Arthur's request." Jessica's breath caught in surprise. "A field hospital? But there's supposed to be a house there. I inherited it from Vincent Warren. I have the documents to prove it, I can show you." William looked at the passenger with irony. "Sure, I believe you. Why would I need to see those documents? I wouldn't understand them anyway." Jessica bit her lip in offense and turned away, looking out the window. What news? How could this happen? She had hoped so much for this house, and now what? Go back? And all because of her ex-husband, Robert, who kicked her and her daughter out of the house after their divorce to indulge in pleasures with his young mistress. Soon the village appeared. Jessica's desired house was on the outskirts, and she noticed it right away. As it turned out later, the taxi driver was right. The house she inherited was indeed where the field hospital was located. How did this happen? Could there really be a mistake in the documents, she thought sadly. Meanwhile, William stopped the car at the gate, which had a cross painted on it in red. "Mom, are we going to live in the hospital?" Sandra asked cautiously. Jessica shrugged uncertainly. "Honestly, I don't know, Sandra. I didn't expect this at all." Placing the suitcases in front of the gate, William took out a small bundle of medicine and started knocking on the gate. "Hey, anyone alive in there?" "Delivery's here," he called out. Jessica looked around warily. It seemed like the whole village was watching her every step or movement. And this was despite the fact that the village itself lived its measured and unhurried life. Dogs barked, geese honked invitingly, and pigs snorted cheerfully, rooting around in their troughs. Meanwhile, the cows peacefully grazed in a distant pasture and were supposed to return home by dusk, driven by the shouts of the village shepherd. Soon, the creak of the front door being opened echoed from the house, and a minute later, the gate swung open, revealing a displeased woman in her 30s dressed in a typical white medical coat. Casting a hostile glance at the guests, she asked, addressing the taxi driver, "Oh, hi, William. And who are these people? Your acquaintances, I suppose?" The driver coughed awkwardly. "No, Mary, I was just passing by, and Jessica and Sandra were walking along the road. I couldn't just leave them. Mary grimaced as if in pain. And what do they need here? And where's the promised medicine? The driver was about to speak up, but Jessica beat him to it. I came to my house, well, not entirely mine, but that's besides the point. How not entirely yours? And anyway, are you sure you're not mistaken? Mary doubted. Well, no, everything's correct. I have the documents. Here, you can take a look. Notarized and certified, Jessica replied, slightly embarrassed by her own frankness. Documents, you say? Well, okay, come in. You'll need to show these papers to the chairman and Arthur, Mary replied more amiably, her behavior revealing traits of a junior medical staff member, most likely a nurse or orderly. Well, now that you've sorted things out here, I'll be off, I suppose. Here, take the medicine. Everything's according to the list. The seal on the package is intact. William said farewell and headed back to his car. Evening was approaching, and he still needed to park the car at their taxi stand. Bye, William, come again, don't forget, Mary chirped in farewell, sending the departing guest an enamored glance. Oh, it's like Shakespearean drama unfolding here. She snarled at me like an angry cat. Must be jealous, perhaps, Jessica thought, barely suppressing a smile. Only when the taxi disappeared around the corner did Mary decide to usher the guests into the house. The nurse refused to help Jessica with the suitcases. Jessica smiled but refrained from approaching Mary. What was the point of escalating tensions on their first meeting? Who knew how their lives would intersect in the future? They might end up working alongside each other. In fact, this house is divided into two halves. That is, it has two owners. One half is the medical station where Arthur works, and the other is the living area. It was abandoned for a long time until the local chairman renovated it so the doctor would have a place to live. His own house burned down, and his son and daughter-in-law live at the other end of the country. He didn't want to bother them. Most likely, your inheritance refers to the half of the house designated for living, Mary explained as she ushered the guests inside. It's quite cozy here, even better than I expected, Jessica cautiously observed. Well, of course. What did you expect? They did quite the renovation here, thanks to the chairman and Arthur, Mary retorted. Jessica bit her lip in offense. Clearly, they weren't rolling out the red carpet for her here. But that was okay. The important thing was that Jessica finally got rid of the burdensome suitcases and could put them down in the hallway. Mary, who's there, dear? Did William bring the medicine? I assume, a weak voice of a man trembling with weakness was heard. No, Arthur, it's something else entirely. William has already left, and now some heirs have shown up, Mary replied with disdain towards the new owners. Jessica's breath caught in outrage. Why was this nurse allowing herself to speak to her in such a tone? Did Jessica and her daughter not deserve basic respect? Heirs? That's serious business. Let them in. And Mary, make some coffee, please. For me and the guests, the man replied in the same weak voice. Mary shot Jessica an angry glance, as if blaming her for Arthur falling ill and not being able to care for his guests himself. All right, I'll make it now, Mary grumbled through gritted teeth. Jessica smiled and walked into the room where Arthur was. To her surprise, she found an 80-year-old man with a face lined with wrinkles and kind gray eyes. Hello, dear guests. Please, come in and tell me what brought you here. The elderly man broke the prolonged silence. Jessica felt uneasy, then took out the folder with the late Vincent's wool from her bag. Here, take a look, she said. I'm sorry for the suddenness, but if it weren't for the circumstances, I would have never come here so unexpectedly, like a bolt from the blue, without warning. Arthur smiled, but didn't bother to examine the wool. He took Jessica's word for it. At 82, he had learned to read people, and he immediately understood that she was telling the truth. Besides, what was the point of lying to this kind woman with a little girl in tow, who was also holding two huge suitcases? Don't worry, I won't turn you away. Please, have a seat, Arthur said. In a way, it's my fault that this happened. The house had been vacant for so long, about 10 years or even more. So, I decided to use it for my needs. This half of the house used to belong to Vincent Warren, my childhood friend. But then, he moved to the city and didn't come back here for 10 years. So, I sort of took over this house on my own. Although, if Vincent were to return, I would give him back this house without any hesitation. What about the renovations? You've put in so much money and effort, Jessica asked skeptically. Arthur waved his hand dismissively. Oh, those funds? Today they're here, tomorrow they're gone. Is that where happiness lies? The main thing is that we've set up a medical station here. Now people from all around the area, and sometimes even from the city, come to us. It's just a shame about health. I could use a colleague to help out in case of emergencies. I'm barely managing on my own. Mary, she's only a nurse and there's so much work. At that moment, a spark of joy lit up in Jessica's eyes. Well, I'm a general practitioner. Maybe I could be of use? Just 2 weeks ago, I was working in the therapy department of the city clinic. Arthur raised an eyebrow in surprise. In the therapy department, you say? That's perfect. We desperately need specialists like you. Maybe you'll come work with us? You could live here and work. I can't promise a big salary because our venture is purely voluntary, you understand? But I'll talk to the chairman. Richard Holland is a reasonable man. I think he could arrange a decent salary for you. Jessica shook her head. Arrange? What do you mean? Do you work independently, separate from the local government? Arthur smiled. Well, you could say that. But we're not exactly self-governing here. We work in what you might call challenging conditions. We provide assistance to the population due to the lack of necessary specialists. Not everyone can afford a trip to the city where even the buses don't run so frequently. And forget about the train. Sometimes there's so much crowd there that a sick person wouldn't even fit in. So we're here to help, and if necessary, we refer people to specialists in the city. Like my mom? Sandra interjected somewhat awkwardly. Yes, like your mom, Arthur replied seriously, as if speaking to an adult. Jessica smiled as she looked at the elderly doctor, catching herself on a very interesting thought. He's actually a good man. Others at his age tend to think only of themselves, but he took the initiative to organize a medical station in the village, which, due to circumstances, lacked medical assistance. Seeing the frozen surprise in Jessica's eyes, Arthur said, make yourselves at home, dearies. I have 2 spare rooms here. I'll stay in one until I find something better, and you and your little girl can have the other. You can even take 2, I won't mind. By my age, I've come to understand that chasing luxury isn't necessary. I'm used to making do with little. You could say I live in Spartan conditions. Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes. How much she had missed such words of support lately, especially from men, from whom she had suffered quite a lot in her life. Mom, when are we going to eat? I'm hungry. Sandra broke the awkward pause again. Jessica absent-mindedly shrugged, then remembered that she had packed a few sandwiches and coffee in a thermos for the journey. But since the trip had been quite eventful, they simply hadn't had time to eat. Let's all have dinner together, Jessica suggested to the elderly doctor. However, Arthur immediately waved his hands in protest. No, thank you. I've had enough coffee. I don't want to eat. I have no appetite, especially after this illness hit me. It's relentless. I used to be into diving when I was younger. You know, diving into the water, exploring riverbeds. Back then, it was called something else. But I, foolishly, spent a lot of time in the water. That's how I got myself a backache. And now I only see the underwater depths on the TV screen, Arthur said with a smile. Are there any medications available now? Medicine has come a long way. Ointments, injections. Jessica cautiously inquired. "Oh, no, dear, I don't want any medications anymore. I mostly treat myself with herbs now. And I help people because I know it's the most I can do for them." Arthur shook his head. "My son and his fiancée live 2,000 kilometers away from me, so I don't get to see them often. But, fortunately, I have a son. But it's still unclear how things will be with children for them." At that moment, the door opened and Mary appeared at the threshold with a tray on which stood 3 cups of fragrant, steaming coffee. "Here, Arthur, help yourself," she said to the elderly doctor. Mary once again pretended as if Jessica and Sandra weren't even in the room. "Thank you, Mary. May God bless you with health and a good husband. Living alone must be tough. Especially in a private house, where you can't do without a man," Arthur said understandingly. After these words, Mary visibly blushed and cast a worried glance at the guests. From her reaction, Jessica immediately understood that the nurse didn't want her to know all her intricacies. However, Jessica had never been overly curious and always avoided gossip or discussing others' shortcomings. "Mary, why didn't you make yourself some coffee?" Arthur worried. "No, I don't feel like it. I just had a cup recently. I think I'll go to bed. I doubt we'll have any more patients tonight," Mary replied with feigned calmness. Jessica immediately understood what was going on, interpreting it as follows. The stubborn nurse simply didn't want to sit at the same table with her. Obviously, Mary, with her practiced eye, saw her as a rival, although Jessica herself didn't see it that way. And what kind of rival could she be to this woman who had lived here since birth? If everything had been fine with Jessica herself, would she have moved to this wilderness with her little daughter in her arms? Unlikely. Just a couple of weeks ago, she had at least had a beloved job, and now there was nothing but half of this dilapidated house in the middle of nowhere. Absent-mindedly sipping the fragrant coffee from her cup, Jessica didn't notice how she sank into sad memories that originated in her past. The whirlpool of events and images enveloped her like a magical kaleidoscope, where events unfolded in an entirely random order. It so happened that she met her future husband, Robert, within the walls of a medical institution, where he was already a successful doctor, while she had just graduated from university and was doing her internship. By that time, rumors about Robert were already circulating, saying that he was a ladies' man and didn't miss a single skirt. Naturally, Jessica didn't believe a word of the future colleagues who warned her that Robert would definitely try to get her into bed. However, it didn't happen immediately, as Jessica was brought up on romantic ideals and never rushed things, wanting to thoroughly study a person's character before letting them into her personal life. Realizing that he wouldn't be able to win over the melancholic beauty so easily, Robert changed tactics and began to court her with the flair typical of those who can afford it. The young man's parents held a high position in the Ministry of Health, and therefore, they actively promoted their son, eventually securing his appointment as the head of a department. It's worth mentioning that no one among the therapy staff doubted the fact that Robert got his position solely thanks to his father and mother. It was they who pushed him forward like an icebreaker, breaking a path through the bitterly cold waters of the Arctic. In fact, more experienced and qualified doctors were vying for the position of department head, but it was Robert who became the leader. Although it may seem like fantasy to someone, conquering this peak was just one step in the rapid development of his career for the young man. Ironically, his appointment coincided with the beginning of his relationship with Jessica, who finally reciprocated his courtship and began to consider herself his fiancée. At some point, Robert noticeably tensed up because marriage at this stage was not in his plans at all. On the other hand, being with Jessica made him feel comfortable, and he saw nothing wrong with tying himself to her in marriage. Moreover, at that time, Jessica was just 2 months pregnant, which ultimately tipped the scales towards a quick wedding. Honestly, Robert had always dreamed of living as a bachelor until he was 40, without children and without family obligations. But after hearing about the pregnancy, his life changed drastically. Fantasizing on this topic, Robert often saw himself as a knight and conqueror, winning women's hearts with enviable regularity and persistence. But with Jessica, such tactics didn't work because she refused to be the mistress of a wealthy boss. Most annoying for her was that everyone in the department believed that Robert would now push his chosen one up the career ladder, just as his parents had done not so long ago. To the disappointment of many, Robert turned out to be a poor manager, and all his work boiled down to the fact that he openly took bribes from anyone who offered them. Meanwhile, Jessica had a very difficult time, especially during her pregnancy. She suffered from morning sickness and dizziness, which frustrated her and prevented her from focusing on anything specific. As expected, there was no support from Robert. For example, when Jessica woke up at night from discomfort in her abdomen, her husband simply turned over to the other side or even went to another room and turned on the TV at full volume. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that Jessica was carrying twins, whom her negligent husband most likely saw on the monitor in the ultrasound room. Robert then seemed to go off the rails. For some incomprehensible reason, he suddenly started disappearing at work for days at a time, not coming home for several days. To Jessica's timid questions about where exactly he was disappearing to, her husband simply replied, "Problems, Jessica. They're overwhelming. The ministry keeps calling, the chief doctor drags me in, and then he prescribes a pill for everyone. So work is tough now, not like before." Concerned, Jessica said. "But still, you should take care of yourself, otherwise your lack of sleep will lead to no good. And again, your diet. You know, a poor diet can lead to gastritis and ulcers. And what are you going to eat there when you don't leave the office for days?" Robert struggled to suppress a smirk and immediately replied, "Oh, nothing, Jessica, I'll figure it out. I'll run to the canteen. You know, it's not far from us. Just across the road, and you're there." In reality, he didn't go to any canteen at all, spending all his free time with his mistress. It was rumored that by the time Sandra was born, he already had 3 mistresses. And he even managed to live with several families simultaneously without burdening himself with any conditions or cares. As luck would have it, the contractions caught Jessica at home because she had hoped until the last moment that the girls would be born on the schedule set by the doctors. But as it turned out, everything turned out completely differently. Unfortunately, Robert wasn't home at that time, and Jessica had to call an ambulance, which arrived half an hour late due to a severe blizzard and icy roads. Meanwhile, her husband was having fun at a roadside hotel with his mistress and didn't even think about how bad his wife might be feeling. To avoid being disturbed, the young man turned off his phone and only found out about the birth of his daughter 2 days later. But even more shocking was not this, but the fact that the first thing Robert asked was, "Why is there only one girl? Where is the second one? What happened? Jessica, why are you silent? Why are you silent?" The young woman in labor quietly sobbed, then broke into hysterical sobs. It turned out that the doctors couldn't save both babies. And Jessica's joy at the birth of one daughter was overshadowed by the grief of losing the second. No, the cesarean section was performed on time, and the attending surgeon did everything as required. It seemed like there was nothing dangerous about this simple operation. But as is known, every case is unique. And therefore, there is always a risk that something will go wrong. But this didn't mean that Jessica blamed her medical colleagues or anyone else. She understood life throws all sorts of challenges. After the birth of Sandra, for some inexplicable reason, Robert cooled towards his wife and began to consider her responsible for the death of their second daughter. "It's all your fault. If you had gone to the hospital on time, everything would have been fine. But no, you waited, didn't you? You should have been in the pathology department for 2 weeks as prescribed. But no, you felt the pull of your family home," he accused. Jessica paled and her expression changed. "What does that have to do with anything? You're not an obstetrician. You're the head of the therapeutic department, and you have no right to tell me what would have been better or worse," she replied. Robert smirked. "Well, look, don't think I'll cover for you. In 3 years, if you don't come back from maternity leave, I'll fire you. Or better yet, transfer you somewhere remote. You know, employees from the provinces are always asking for valuable personnel. So I'll send you there if you keep behaving like this. Do whatever you want. You can even send me to the middle of nowhere. I don't care anymore. Jessica replied tearfully. As it turned out, the upbringing of their daughter was entirely on her shoulders. Robert, meanwhile, disappeared at work for days on end, turning his life into an endless series of intrigues and revelries. However, now Robert no longer hid the fact that he spent time not at his desk, but flaunted in the company of leggy beauties or new, doe-eyed nurses. Unnoticed, 8 years passed, which seemed like an eternity to Jessica. Day after day, the same routine, work, home, work. Probably like all young mothers. During this time, Jessica managed to send Sandra to kindergarten after her maternity leave and then to school. And she did it all herself, as there was hardly any support from her husband. Jessica's mother-in-law and father-in-law also didn't warm up to Sandra and rarely agreed to let their granddaughter visit their home. At some point, Jessica even thought that they considered her granddaughter to be someone else's or born of another man. But how could she have another man when she worked with Robert in the same department side by side? It's hard to say how long their joint existence would have continued if, at one wonderful moment, Jessica hadn't met one of the elderly patients who had been in the clinic for 3 weeks already. To her dismay, Vincent didn't hide the fact that he probably wouldn't leave the medical facility anymore and therefore treated everything with philosophical calm and endurance. Jessica, however, got along with him from the first days of their acquaintance. The wise man had lived a difficult life and, above all, he loved to talk about his childhood in a remote village. According to Vincent, he still had a house there, where his parents once lived. Due to the seriousness of the man's illness, Jessica listened to him attentively, well aware that in some moments, the elderly patient might embellish his past, while in others, he might add negative colors. Moreover, Jessica realized that she couldn't help Vincent anymore. On the other hand, she could alleviate his condition with care and carefully selected medication therapy. Thank you, Jessica. You're all I have left. I had a son, but he disappeared, the scoundrel. He ended up behind bars from his youth, and he's been there ever since. He'll be released, roam free for a year, and then back again. Recently, I received word that he perished during a riot in the prison. I don't know what happened there, but they sent me a zinc coffin. And in it, there was an obituary in 2 words. They didn't even let me open the lid. Well, I cried, mourned, and then organized the funeral. But as soon as I did that, I ended up here. And here you ran some tests. In short, they quickly found out that I was ill. I used to endure it, toughen up, try to treat myself with herbs. But now I understand that it was all in vain. Oh, Vincent, you still have plenty of life ahead of you. Let me prescribe you a new medication, and you will feel noticeably better. You can be sure of that. I've dealt with more severe cases than yours, Jessica hastened to reassure him. However, deceiving the seasoned man with years of experience was already impossible. Once, closer to evening during her shift, he called her over and asked her to sit on the table next to his bed. Seeing the doctor's frozen question in her eyes, the elderly patient continued. Listen, Jessica, forgive me if I'm overstepping. But you're Robert. Well, the head of the department, he's a bad person. He's cheating on you right and left, not just with one, but with several women. You see, they, the fools, don't even know about it. But I'm in the department, so to speak, every day. I notice everything. I'm sorry for telling you this so directly. Any other person in my place would have kept silent, pretended that nothing was happening, but I can't do that. Leave him, or better yet, run away. And take your daughter with you. I saw her, Sandra, she's a good girl. She came to see you during lunchtime. Jessica looked at the elderly patient with pity. What else could she say to him? Vincent had voiced aloud what had been accumulating in her soul like boiling volcano magma all this time. Perhaps she simply didn't have the strength to leave her husband and start over. Not everyone can be fatal beauties with hearts full of ice. If he were just cheating on you, Jessica, I wouldn't say anything. But, you see, he speaks such nasty things about you, mocks you, and even in public. Everyone here knows about it, but you're clueless. Leave him, my dear, leave him. You'll raise the child yourself, you're not stupid. And don't have anything to do with this bloodsucker anymore, Vincent added with regret, shaking his head. Jessica looked at the elderly man doubtfully. Where would I go, Vincent? I have nowhere to live. I live in his house with Sandra. And there's work, too. He's my boss, after all. Whatever he says, I do. Subordination, you know, hasn't been cancelled. Vincent paused for a moment, then said, Listen, Jessica, here's the thing. I have a little house in the village, in my hometown. I haven't been there for about 10 years, but they say it's still standing. And not just standing, but standing strong. It'll last another decade at least. So, I want to leave it to you, so you and your daughter can start a new life. You treated me like a human being, with all your heart. So, I want to repay kindness with kindness, as my parents taught me. After hearing these words, Jessica protested vigorously. No, no, Vincent, I can't accept this. How could I? That's your hometown, so to speak. What's it got to do with me? I'm just a single mother from the city. To her sincere regret, it was impossible to dissuade Vincent. Taking her hand, he added softly, I'll give this house to you and your daughter only. Nobody else deserves it. Of course, I could leave it to the state. But I don't want them to tear it down brick by brick in the village. And there'll be nothing left there but an empty lot. I want some memory of me to remain, and the house will be your support. It's a bit far, of course, about 3 or 4 hours drive from here, but I think you'll manage. Jessica shook her head doubtfully. Well, I don't know, Vincent, if I can manage it or not. I'll try, of course, but we'll see. I'll need to prepare too. Sandra goes to school. Even though it's vacation time now, it's still a new place, new conditions. Vincent nodded in agreement, then laid his final card on the table before Jessica. And don't delay your resignation, dear, because your husband wants to help you. How so help? Jessica asked, confused. Well, how? By firing you, that is, on some fabricated charge. I overheard Robert discussing it with his lackeys. You probably know who I mean. Jessica clenched her jaw. Yes, I know, probably a nurse, and maybe some colleagues. That's right, dear, exactly, some colleagues. So keep your ears open, otherwise, if you get fired, it'll be much worse for you than if you leave of your own accord, so to speak. And then, look, I'll still transfer the house to you, so don't think too long. Get ready and go. Jessica nodded in agreement, unaware that their conversation would be their last. To Vincent's credit, it should be noted that on the same day, he called a notary to his bedside and drew up a deed of gift, and the next morning Vincent was no more. Unfortunately, the departure of the elderly patient coincided in the most inexplicable way with the threat he had warned Jessica about. Robert, deciding to get rid of his annoying wife and daughter, had already raised his hand to strike first. To start with, he openly accused Jessica of negligence and irresponsibility in the workplace during a staff meeting. In turn, his wife didn't hesitate to retaliate immediately. And how do you see my negligence, Robert? Robert smirked maliciously. How come? For example, you spent days in Vincent Warren's room, and what about the other patients, were they worse off than him? I don't need such employees. I need order, not what you've done here. So, pack your things and leave. Struggling to hold back her emotions, Jessica asked softly, what things do I need to pack? Robert smiled even wider. Well, what things? Don't play the fool. The ones that are in my house. Take a hint. From now on, we're living separately. At that moment, it felt like a bucket of ice water was poured over Jessica. Separately? What about Sandra? We've been together for 8 years. Well, 8 years is not eternity. Let's not drag this out. Okay, I won't fire you on grounds, so as not to tarnish your biography. Maybe you'll start a new career in a new place. Although personally, I think you have nothing left to do in this town, her husband concluded. Leaving the office of her hated spouse, Jessica stopped in tears in the middle of the corridor and burst into sobs. In one instant, her world turned upside down. Vincent was gone in the morning, and a couple of hours later his most unpleasant warning came true. In that moment, Jessica understood that she needed to take the words of the elderly patient seriously. In a rush, she gathered her belongings and headed to that remote village Vincent had talked so much about. Jessica realized that she would have to start her life from scratch, so it was uncertain whether her story would be written on a crystal-clear page without blemishes, or whether it would resemble a dictation written by a mediocre student. Most likely, there would be many problems, especially with finding work. But who needs a therapist in the wilderness? Meanwhile, thanks to his connections in court, Robert finalized the divorce in a matter of days, avoiding the mandatory waiting period. In doing so, Jessica made a very serious mistake. She refused alimony from her despised husband. She regretted it later more than once. Now, as she sipped her fragrant coffee, she once again caught herself thinking that the initial period in the village would be very difficult for her. So, Jessica, what have you decided? Will you assist me? Or rather, you will be the one seeing patients, and I'll assist you, because I hardly have any strength left. Thank you, Vincent, for sending such a person to our village. May he rest in peace, remarked Arthur. Jessica pondered. On one hand, she got accommodation and a job, but on the other hand, she realized that living in half of a house with her child would not be entirely comfortable. Nevertheless, what good was it that they had been living in the huge mansion of Robert's parents all this time, which they had given to their son for his wedding? What did it lead to? Jessica would never step through that door again and would live her own life. Yes, Arthur, I agree. Just give me some time to adapt and learn about your medical station, she said cautiously. Of course, dear, I understand everything. You probably had different equipment and a different office in your city, and here it's minimalistic, as you can see. We hope for sponsors. Maybe some patron will help. But what kind of sponsors can villagers be? Well, they might bring milk or a dozen eggs, but it's still support for us. But we'll bring so much help to people, Arthur smiled. His pleasant voice had a calming effect, setting a kind and positive tone. Just as the nurse took an instant dislike to Jessica at first sight. Initially, Jessica mistakenly believed that Mary's jealousy extended not only to taxi driver William, but also to the elderly doctor. However, it wasn't jealousy in the literal sense. More likely, Mary simply wanted to be first in everything, and Jessica's appearance on the scene threatened her status as the leading figure in the world of rural medicine. Of course, the nurse always deferred to the experienced physician because Jessica had a diploma and extensive medical knowledge. Certainly, Jessica could only perform minor procedures independently, such as injections for drips, blood pressure measurement, or blood sugar tests. But overall, Mary couldn't compare to the general practitioner. She envied Jessica and saw her as a rival, an intruder trying to assert herself at someone else's expense. A week passed. When Arthur began to feel slightly better and started seeing patients at the medical station, Jessica quickly immersed herself in work and became his right hand in a matter of days. Continuously thanking the late Vincent, she worked for the common good, helping everyone in the village from small to large. Sometimes, in moments of special emotional mood, Arthur recalled the old times when he and Vincent studied in the same class. Living nearby, they played football to exhaustion, went fishing, and swam in the river. Later, after the army, Vincent moved to the city, while Arthur stayed in the village. It was said that there used to be a full-fledged district hospital here. But after the restructuring, funding ceased and the building was left empty. The hospital was disbanded and the equipment was taken to the district. I was very upset about that. How could this happen? The village will wither away. As a promising doctor, I was offered to move to the region, but I decided to stay here. For a while, I worked as an ambulance paramedic, then saw patients at home. And when I retired, I realized we definitely need to open a medical station to help people, especially those who live in such a remote province and can't travel to the district clinic," Arthur reminisced. Jessica nodded. "Yes, you're right. I agree. You've conceived a good deed. Simply amazing. And indeed, it's not easy to get to the district center." Arthur smiled. "Yes, the roads here are something else. You have to be careful. Both motorists and bus drivers have a tough time. Although William, he's a golden guy. He used to be from the orphanage. He and his older sister were orphans. You probably don't even know that William doesn't live alone." "With whom?" "He's married, I suppose?" Jessica asked casually. "Well, no, Jessica. Our William is raising his nephew, the son of his deceased sister, that is. She and her husband died in a car accident and the boy was facing foster care. So William took him under his wing. Now Calvin Garrett goes to kindergarten and William works as a taxi driver in his spare time. But when the shifts don't align, he has to hire a nanny. You know, it costs money and not a small amount. So I try to help however I can. I throw him some odd jobs, arrange career work for him," Arthur replied. Frankly, Jessica was shocked by the elderly doctor's story. She had always thought that William was just an ordinary taxi driver making ends meet. But now she saw the guy in a completely different light. At some point, she involuntarily compared William to Robert, her ex-husband, and realized her fiancé was nowhere near as good as this young taxi driver. Once, in a candid and heartfelt conversation with Arthur, Jessica learned that a year ago Mary had been in a relationship with William but left him after he decided to take guardianship of his nephew. Then, in a fit of anger, Mary told William that the perpetually crying baby was unpleasant to her. The young taxi driver reacted calmly, without causing scenes or scandals, simply gathered his things and disappeared into the night with the baby carriage. Yet Mary and William had been seriously preparing for a wedding that was supposed to take place in just a couple of weeks. Of course, when the angry veil lifted from the eyes of the young nurse, she regretted what she had said and repeatedly begged William for forgiveness. But the guy never forgave her. Deep down, he understood that he could never trust such a two-faced and cynical person like Mary ever again. Since Jessica and William felt mutual attraction and sympathy from the moment they met, Mary didn't like it at all. She tried every trick in the book to sabotage their communication. On the other hand, no matter how hard she tried, Jessica was her boss, so Mary could only cause her minor troubles trying to portray the new doctor in an unfavorable light. But William seemed oblivious to it all. He continued to interact with Jessica, who he liked more and more. Watching their conversation, Arthur smiled and silently thanked fate for sending him such a clever assistant. And he didn't even suspect that the late Vincent had acted so deliberately to kill two birds with one stone. Firstly, to help the unfortunate mother get rid of the burden of her unfaithful husband, and secondly, to provide the beloved village with a highly qualified general practitioner. At first, Jessica was even upset with Vincent, who didn't tell her that the house was initially divided into two parts, but eventually she realized the village was truly the best place on earth. On weekends, she walked by the river with Sandra and William, gathered mushrooms in the forest, and enjoyed nature. In those moments, Jessica immediately remembered how sad and lonely she felt when she spent weekends with her ex-husband Robert, who always seemed preoccupied. Mary, however, was irritated and secretly cried, seeing Jessica and William spending time together. Once, the sly nurse even complained directly to Arthur, saying that Jessica spoke ill of him. But the elderly doctor immediately understood that Mary wanted to drive a wedge between him and his colleague. "Mary, I don't believe a word you say. You'll have to forgive me, but jealousy and envy aren't the best qualities. Accept it, let go of William, he's not yours anymore," Mary muttered, slamming the door. Unnoticed, 6 months passed. Jessica and William became so close that they already considered themselves a couple. Despite Mary's machinations, their relationship grew stronger day by day, filling their hearts with love and mutual respect. One day, In utter despair, Mary tossed a lipstick into William's car, knowing full well that Jessica didn't use cosmetics. Deep down, she hoped that her rival would surely notice the foreign belongings and flare up. But Jessica just laughed and threw the lipstick in the trash. And Mary mourned over it for a long time, as Elite cosmetics weren't cheap. A month after that, Jessica learned that Robert had become a suspect in a criminal case involving large bribes and fraud at the city clinic. As a result of a massive investigation, not only the chief physician was removed, but also almost all the heads of departments who were caught abusing their positions. Jessica found out about this from the newspapers she regularly subscribed to. She read them together with Sandra, thereby achieving a double result, keeping up with the latest news from the city and helping her daughter develop her reading skills. And some time later, a new chief physician arrived in the village, who offered Jessica to return and take the vacant position as head of department. She looked at him with surprise and shook her head negatively. "No, I'm sorry, I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying. Everything suits me here," Jessica said firmly. At that moment, Arthur intervened in the conversation. "Jessica, wait, don't be hasty. Maybe you should go after all. It's such an opportunity to advance your career." But Jessica responded firmly and decisively. "No, I'm staying here." Meanwhile, Mary held her breath, imagining that Jessica might gather her things and leave for the city, leaving Arthur and William in her care. But Jessica decided to stay no matter what. And Mary realized her plans wouldn't come to fruition as Jessica had stubbornly refused the offer from the newcomer. Once Jessica had the opportunity to prove herself in the city, but she didn't take it. Now, the young mother had found herself here in the province and didn't want to leave what had become dear to her heart. At that moment, something clicked in Mary's mind. Catching up with the clinic's chief physician already on the street, she quietly asked, "Joseph, maybe you'll take me as a nurse. I've been working here in the province for 4 years, and I want to go to the city to get accommodation and opportunities for career growth." Joseph Harris raised his eyebrow in surprise, then looked around for Arthur, who stood on the porch of the clinic. "Colleague, can I take Mary with me?" The elderly doctor nodded in agreement. "Of course you can. Mary is a worthy employee, diligent, and very capable. Take her, you won't regret it." Since then, Jessica and Mary never met again. It was rumored that Mary's ambition made such an impression on the new chief physician that just 3 months later he proposed to the provincial beauty. Ironically, at the same time, William and Jessica tied the knot. And they did it without pomp and circumstance, getting married in a small church located in a neighboring village. Residents from several nearby villages gathered to celebrate this remarkable event, each of whom wanted to congratulate their beloved doctor, who they had visited at least once, and the hospitable taxi driver. Watching the joyful faces of the newlyweds, Arthur smiled and thanked his childhood friend Vincent, who changed their lives for the better and gave them an invaluable specialist dedicated to his work with heart and soul. If you enjoyed the story, please support it with a like and a comment. All the best to you.